we need to discuss something that is, perhaps, the most forbidden truth in the entire Western narrative. I am not talking about passing headlines, this week's price of oil, or the latest political scandal in Washington. I am talking about the central pillar, the fundamental promise that has sustained the American empire for nearly a century. The promise that, if you are born in the United States, if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you would have a dignified life. You would be middle class. What happens when that promise is not just broken, but is revealed as the greatest economic fraud in modern history? The economist Richard Wolff, one of the few intellectual voices in the United States who dares to challenge the system rather than just criticizing one party or another, said something the corporate media does not know how to process. He stated, unequivocally, the American middle class is disappearing. And no one knows how to stop it. Pause and consider that phrase. The most terrifying part is not the first, the disappearing. Many of us, who look beyond the official statistics, have already sensed this. We see the quiet desperation, the rising debt, the opioid epidemic, the Rust Belt. The truly devastating part is the second, and no one knows how to stop it. What no one in the media dares to say aloud, what neither the Democrats nor Trump's Republicans will admit, is why they don't know how to stop it. They don't know how to stop it because stopping the disappearance of the middle class would mean reversing 40 years of policies that made them, the elites, obscenely wealthy. They don't know how to stop it because the collapse of the middle class is not an accident, it is not an unfortunate side effect. It is the inevitable result of the neoliberal project. It was a choice. Here, at Critical Compass, we understand this dynamic. The central thesis we have always argued is that the American empire is in a state of terminal decline, but its elites are in profound psychological denial. They were only able to project their military and financial power around the globe because, first, they cannibalized their own population. The disappearance of the American middle class is not a flaw in the system, it is the system functioning exactly as it was designed to since the 1970s. It was a conscious decision by Wall Street and Washington. The decision that capital would no longer have loyalty to the nation. They took the jobs, the good manufacturing jobs that built that middle class, and they exported them. They sent them to Mexico, then to China, and to wherever labor was cheapest, to maximize shareholder profits. And what did they give the American worker in return? What did they offer to maintain the illusion of prosperity while real wages stagnated? They offered credit. They replaced wages with debt. While China, and now the multipolar world, the BRICS, were building factories, infrastructure, ports, and high-speed rail, the United States was building shopping malls, investment banks, and empty office complexes. They created an economy of illusion, a finance and consumption-based economy fueled by debt. And now, that bill has finally come due. The empire is in desperation because the old tools no longer work. The weaponized dollar is being bypassed. The sanctions are backfiring. And internally, the social structure that upheld the empire, the middle class, is hollow. And that is why Richard Wolff is right. They do not know how to stop it, because the neoliberal capitalist system they exported to the world is the very poison now killing the host. Let us dissect the evidence. Let us coldly analyze why the middle class is not just in trouble, but is structurally disappearing, and how this is a deliberate act of economic suicide on the part of the elites. Exhibit A, the internal collapse, begins with what Richard Wolff calls the original sin of the modern American economy. Since the mid-1970s, the productivity of the American worker has soared. With technology, with automation, each worker began producing exponentially more value per hour. By basic economic logic, wages should have soared along with it. But they did not. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, stagnated. They have remained essentially flat for 50 years. Think about that. The worker is producing double, triple, but is earning the same as their grandfather did in 1975. The question the mainstream media never asks is, if the workers did not get the money from their own productivity, who did? The answer is obvious to anyone with the courage to look. This vast wealth, trillions and trillions of dollars, was all funneled to the top. To the 1%, to the 0.1%, to the shareholders, to the CEOs whose salaries rose by thousands of percent while their employees' wages remained frozen. They effectively destroyed the social contract. But how do you keep the population quiet? How do you keep the American dream alive while you are stealing people's wages? And here enters the second phase of the collapse, the replacement of wages with debt. This was a deliberate policy. The Federal Reserve, under Alan Greenspan and his successors, kept interest rates artificially low, not to help the small businessmen, but to inflate asset bubbles and make credit cheap. Your salary wasn't enough to buy a house. No problem, the bank will give you a subprime mortgage without verifying your income. Your salary doesn't cover the month's bills. No problem, here is a credit card with a sky-high limit. Your child can't pay for university, where prices have soared because the government guaranteed the loans. No problem, they can sign for a $100,000 student debt that will follow them for the rest of their life, a debt they cannot even discharge through bankruptcy. What they call the middle class today is not what it was in 1960. The middle class of 1960 had savings. Today's middle class is, in reality, a precariat. They are defined not by their assets, but by their debts. Total U.S. household debt exceeds $17 trillion. Credit card debt has surpassed $1.1 trillion. Student debt, $1.7 trillion. This is not prosperity. This is servitude. They created an entire generation of debt servants, people who cannot quit the job they hate, who cannot demand better wages, because they are one paycheck away from total financial collapse. They must feed the bank every month. And now, the financial system that created this illusion is itself breaking. The third phase of this economic suicide is the elite's desperate response to the inevitable crisis of their own system. When the system broke in 2008, due to this exact subprime mortgage fraud, who was saved? Was it the homeowners? Was it the workers who lost their jobs? No. They saved the banks. They printed trillions of dollars out of thin air, so-called quantitative easing, and gave it to the very architects of the fraud. They did it again in 2020. And all this money printing, this flood of false liquidity, had to go somewhere. It went into the stock market, inflating the biggest bubble in history, making billionaires even richer. And, inevitably, it leaked into the real economy in the form of inflation. The inflation we are seeing today was not caused by stimulus checks to ordinary citizens. That is what they want you to believe. It was caused by decades of money printing to save the elites from their own failures, and by a globalized, just-in-time supply system that shattered at the first sign of stress. And what is the Federal Reserve's solution to the inflation they created? Raise interest rates. But think about what this means. In an economy that is based not on wages, but on debt, raising interest rates is like tightening the garrote on the debtor's neck. They are making mortgages unaffordable. They are making car financing impossible. They are raising the interest on the credit cards that people use to buy food. They are, consciously, trying to induce a recession. They are trying to break the back of the worker, to create unemployment, so that workers will stop asking for raises. This is economic suicide. They are destroying domestic demand, the only thing still propping up the U.S. service economy, to save the value of the dollar and the balance sheets of the banks. They are amputating the arm that feeds them, sacrificing what remains of the middle class on the altar of financial stability. And it is here that psychological denial enters its most theatrical form. They cannot admit the problem is internal. They cannot admit that neoliberal capitalism has failed. So, they need an external scapegoat. It's China's fault. And so, we enter the fourth phase of weakness, the theater of tariffs. Whether under Trump or under Biden, the policy is the same. They impose massive tariffs on Chinese goods, pretending this will bring the jobs back and punish Beijing. But, as we have explained countless times here at Critical Compass, tariffs are, quite simply, a tax paid by the importer. And who is the importer? It is American companies, which pass that cost directly on to whom? To the American consumer. They are taxing the very people who are already being crushed by inflation and debt. They are making basic goods more expensive for the disappearing middle class, all to maintain the illusion that they are being tough on China. It is an act of desperation. It is an admission that they can no longer compete. China produces better and cheaper electric vehicles. Washington's response is not to innovate, not to build a better industry, not to pay better wages. The response is to ban, to tax, to sanction. It is the mindset of a declining empire, which uses brute force and protectionist rules because it has lost the battle of real production. They are trapped in a snare of their own making. They exported their industry to China and are now angry that China has industrialized. They replaced wages with debt and now must raise interest rates, making that debt unpayable. That is why Richard Wolff is correct. No one in Washington knows how to stop it. Because the only way to stop it would be to admit defeat. It would be to implement a real New Deal, to massively tax the billionaires, to break up the big banks, to cancel the debts, to reindustrialize the country. But that would mean the end of the elite's power. And they would rather see the empire burn to the ground, and take the middle class with it, than admit that their model has failed. While American elites are busy managing the controlled collapse of their own middle class, the rest of the world has stopped waiting for a Western recovery. They are building an alternative system. This is Exhibit B, the rise of the multipolar world, a world that is not just surviving without U.S. leadership, but is actively thriving by proving that Washington's neoliberal model was wrong. The contrast could not be more stark. For 50 years, Washington and the International Monetary Fund told the developing world, "You want to be rich like us? It's simple. Privatize everything. Cut social spending. Open your markets. Let foreign capital flow in and out freely. Destroy your state-owned enterprises." It was what they called the Washington Consensus. And what happened to the countries that followed this recipe? They were plundered. Their national industries were destroyed, their resources were bought for pennies on the dollar by multinational corporations, and they were drowned in dollar-denominated debt. But some nations did not follow this path. And they are the ones winning today. Let us begin with the most obvious example, China. China never followed the Washington Consensus. It did the exact opposite. It maintained state control over strategic sectors, especially the banks. It controlled the flow of capital. It used massive state investment to build the greatest infrastructure the world has ever seen. It educated its population. They did not wait for the free market to magically create prosperity. They planned for prosperity. And the result? They lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. They became the workshop of the world. And now, they are becoming the world's innovation lab. While the American middle class disappears, the Chinese middle class has exploded. And now, Washington, in its desperation, accuses China of unfair practices. What do they mean by unfair? They mean China did not let Wall Street dictate its economic policy. And China is not alone. The BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now the expanded BRICS Plus, including energy powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran, represent a tectonic shift. In terms of purchasing power parity, the combined GDP of the BRICS is already larger than that of the G7. Think about what that means. The old club of wealthy Western nations is no longer the economic center of the planet. And they are growing much faster. The growth of India and China, even in a slow year, is double or triple the anemic growth of the United States or Europe. But more important than the numbers is the philosophy. The multipolar world is quietly building the institutions of a post-American system. They are creating the new development bank, an alternative to the IMF and World Bank. They are conducting trade in their own currencies, the yuan, the rial, the rupee, the ruble, bypassing the US dollar. When the United States tried to destroy the Russian economy with unprecedented sanctions, what happened? Russia did not collapse. The ruble did not turn to dust. Russia simply turned east. It sold its oil and gas to China and India, often at a discount, and bought everything it needed from Asia. The dollar weapon, the empire's most powerful tool, failed spectacularly. In fact, it backfired. By turning the dollar into a weapon, the United States proved to the rest of the world that holding dollar reserves was dangerous. They accelerated the process of de-dollarization by a decade. But we don't need to look only to Asia. Let's look at America's own backyard. Let's look at Mexico. For decades, Mexico was the poster child for neoliberalism. They privatized everything. They signed NAFTA. And the result? Stagnant wages, rising poverty, and the country being overrun by cartels. Then, in 2018, something extraordinary happened. The people elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. AMLO is an economic nationalist. He fundamentally rejected the Washington Consensus. And what did he do? He did the unthinkable for the neoliberal mindset. He strengthened state-owned enterprises. He invested billions in Pemex, the oil company, and CFE, the electricity company, stating that energy sovereignty is the foundation of national sovereignty. He raised the minimum wage by over 100% in real terms. He launched massive infrastructure programs, like the Mayan train. He implemented universal pensions for the elderly. What did the mainstream media and the Chicago school economists predict? They predicted apocalypse. They said inflation would explode, investment would flee, that the Mexican peso would collapse. And what actually happened? Mexico became one of the best performing economies in the world. Inflation is under control. Foreign direct investment, especially from China, is flooding the country in the nearshoring phenomenon. And the Mexican peso? It became the super peso, one of the strongest currencies in the world against the dollar. Mexico, under AMLO, proved neoliberalism wrong. He proved that investing in your people, strengthening the state, and seeking sovereignty does not lead to disaster, but to prosperity. This is the world that the elites in Washington cannot understand. A world where China dominates electric vehicles, like BYD, and the only US response is 100% tariffs. A world where Russia survives sanctions. A world where Mexico proves their model is a fraud. They are surrounded by evidence that their system has failed. And yet, they remain in profound denial. Which brings us to the ultimate symbol of this denial. The character who perfectly personifies the illusion, the rage, and the theatricality of the collapsing empire, Donald Trump. It is crucial to understand that Donald Trump is not the cause of American decline. He is the most visible symptom. He is the product of a nation whose middle class was destroyed and left behind for 40 years. Trump is the personification of psychological denial. His is the mindset of an empire that cannot accept it is no longer in charge. When he talks about the economy, he doesn't talk about structural reindustrialization. He doesn't talk about how financial capitalism destroyed productive capitalism. He doesn't talk about how Apple and Nike got rich by exporting jobs. No. He talks about bad deals. He talks about how China ripped us off or Mexico is taking advantage of us. His worldview is that of a reality TV show. He believes geopolitics is a matter of attitude, of strength, of bluster. He is the perfect villain for this theater because he distracts everyone from the real problem. The real problem is not the Chinese worker. The real problem is not the Mexican immigrant. The real problem is the American multinational corporations and Wall Street banks that exported the jobs and sucked the wealth out of the country. But Trump will never blame that system because he is its greatest beneficiary. He is a product of financial capitalism and debt. So, what does he offer the white working class that was destroyed by the Rust Belt? He doesn't offer a plan to bring back the unionized auto industry jobs. He offers theater. He offers a wall. He offers scapegoats. He says, the problem isn't that your boss moved your factory to Shanghai to make 50% more profit. The problem is the immigrant picking lettuce in Texas. He focuses on tariffs, which, as we've seen, only punish the American consumer. He believes he can simply bully China or Mexico into bowing. But he doesn't realize, and this is why his anger is so great, that Mexico and China don't need to bow anymore. They have other options. They have BRICS. Trump is the final illusion of the empire. He is the belief that if only they could have a strong enough leader, a leader who banged the table harder, the world would magically return to the 1950s, when the United States was the only factory left standing. But that world is gone. And it is gone because America's own elites chose to destroy it in the name of short-term profit. Trump and Biden are just two sides of the same coin of denial. Biden wants to manage the decline with more sanctions and proxy wars. Trump wants to manage it with more tariffs and walls. Neither of them has the courage, or even the desire, to confront the real problem that Richard Wolff identifies. Neither of them knows how to stop the disappearance of the middle class, because both are loyal servants to the system that demands this disappearance. Neoliberal financial capitalism demands that labor be cheap and that capital be king. You cannot have a prosperous, healthy middle class under this system. It is a structural impossibility. And so, the empire continues its descent. It runs off the cliff without looking down, obsessed with external scapegoats, while its own social foundation, the middle class that Richard Wolff correctly identifies as moribund, crumbles beneath its feet. The change we are witnessing is real. It is profound, and it is inevitable. The American empire, built on the promise of a prosperous middle class, is in its final stages of denial. Its elites, be they Democrats or Republicans, are trapped in their own ideological snare. They do not know how to stop the collapse, because they are the collapse. But you, who have watched this analysis to the end, now know the truth. You understand the mechanics of the decline. You understand that the disappearance of the American middle class was not an accident, but a project. And you understand that the multipolar world is not waiting for rescue, it is building the alternative. If this analysis has made you see the world through new eyes, if you understand that there is a struggle for dignity taking place, then do not stay silent. Share this video, so that more people can understand what the traditional media will never explain.